Greetings builders, Daniel here, and today on our best build selection we're going to highlight 3 builds that use all the terrible agony of code to destroy their enemies. As always, don't forget that if you decide to make any of those builds, you can find links for the complete guides in the video description. The first build on our Ice Cold selection is the Ice Shot Deadeye with the Ranger class. This one is a cold archer that fires many projectiles to freeze and shatter dozens of enemies per shot. To use the pros of this build, I'll have to start with this amazing clear speed. It's just so good and effective to run through maps and use your bow to shatter enemies like that. Speaking of which, this build is also very safe, because you not only attack from a safe distance, but also your enemies will be frozen almost 100% of the time. Now to list the cons, I'll start saying that for you to get a good boss damage, you have to stay close to bosses. This activates the extra damage from Shinso. Doing so, you'll be in a more vulnerable position. But don't worry, this build also counts with high evasion and armor. Another issue is that we need many mandatory unique items. Even though this makes the build easier to put together, it also means that it will be harder to cap your elemental resistances. As for budget, this build is not very cheap. It will need at least one Divine Orb to make it. Don't forget that on PoEbuilds.net you can find a list with all these equipment that you need to buy for this build, with direct links with examples being sold from other players. You need 6 mandatory unique items for this build. The first is the Reach of the Council. This unique bow is for clearing maps. It grants 4 extra projectiles and a good amount of physical DPS. Another mandatory bow is the Chainsaw. This one is for killing bosses. It grants a huge amount of extra damage on close range. Following, we have the Lionized Fall. This duel turns all weapon passive nodes in rages into bow nodes. This grants a huge amount of extra damage from our passive skill tree. Next, the Void Fletcher Quiver that grants a lot of extra damage when using your Ice Shot. We also need the Ihir's Iron Body Armor that not only grants a huge amount of added cold damage, but also evasion and spell suppression. Finally, we also need the Yoke of Suffering Amulet that causes all of our damage to be able to shock. This way, our enemies take a lot more damage. For clear speed, I'll give this one 10 out of 10. As a Deadeye, you already have 2 extra projectiles plus 1 chain, and they bounce on walls. Now a Deadeye using a Reach of the Council is just a projectile fest. The boss damage is very good, and I give it 8 out of 10. You just need to remember that you must switch to Chainsaw and be at close range to get all that extra damage. For the survivability, I give it 9 out of 10. It's a very safe build because you can freeze all of your enemies from a good distance. For map bosses, you also have a great time because they will be perma-frozen. Guardians and Pinnacle bosses on the other hand are immune to freeze, and you being in a vulnerable position because of Chainsaw. But the good part is that this build counts with a huge evasion chance, spell suppression and high armor. Following, we have the Cast on Critical Tornado Shot Ice Spear, also with Deadeye and the Ranger class. I like to think of this build as an evolution of the Ice Shot I just showed. It still has an amazing clear speed, but this time it doesn't need to rely on close range to deal big damage to bosses. To list the pros of this build, I would start with this amazing clear speed you've seen. Look how satisfying it is to cast so many ice spears from our tornado shot projectiles. I assure you that you love clearing maps with this build. This build is awesome for bosses as well. It deals a lot of single target damage even from a great distance. Above all, it's also very safe to play it. You kill monsters and map bosses from afar, keeping them frozen into place. And for those bosses that are immune to freeze, you can also keep a safe distance and destroy them. If by any means they manage to reach you, you still have over 90% chance to evade, high chance to suppress spell damage, and high armor. Now to list the cons, I would start saying that this build isn't for everyone. You need a lot of currents to put it together. Another issue is that it isn't easy to build because it needs many specific rare items. As for budget, this build would need at least 12 Divine Orbs to put together. As I said, it's an expensive one. You need 3 mandatory unique items for this build. The first one is the SNF's Mark Helmet that triggers Socketed skills when you attack. This grants even more ice spears. We also need the Maloney's Mechanism. This is the only quiver that has sockets. We're going to use those extra sockets to debuff bosses for a lot more damage. Finally, we also need 2 Intuitive Lips unique jewels to save many points in our passive tree. For clear speed, this one is surely a 10 out of 10. Clearing with this build is not only fast but also extremely satisfying. The boss damage also deserves 10 out of 10. You end up casting many ice spears and all of them can hit the target, causing an incredible shotgun effect. For the survivability, I'll give it 9 out of 10. This build can do everything from a safe distance. It freezes enemies, it has a huge amount of evasion, armor and spell suppression. It will be hard to die if you always mind your position on guardians and pinnacle bosses. Finally, we have the cast on critical ice spear Inquisitor with the Templar class. On this build we use the Cyclone skill to trigger many ice spears and destroy everything in sight. To list the pros of this build, I would start with its damage and clear speed. The greatest thing about Cyclone is that you never need to stop moving. Frostbolts and Ice Novas will kill nearby enemies, while Ice Spears are going to kill enemies you didn't even have the chance to see yet. Since this build hits enemies many times per second with numerous kills, it takes advantage of life on hit mods to have an incredible instant leech. This is awesome because it also counts with a huge life plus energy shield pool. Now for the cons, I start saying that this build also isn't cheap. You need at least a few divine orbs to make it work. Another issue is that this build uses many mandatory unique items. This ends up making it difficult to cap your elemental resistances. Also, just as the cast on critical tornado shot, this one is hard to build because it needs many specific rare items. As for the budget, this build needs at least 5 divine orbs to be made. Even though it's not cheap, it's a great value in order to have a cast on critical character. This build needs 5 mandatory unique items. The first is the Cospris Melee Sword that triggers Socketed Cold spells on critical strikes. We also need the Shaper's Touch Gloves. Since this build stacks attributes, those gloves grant an amazing amount of benefits. Talking about stacking attributes, we also need the Astra Mantis Amulet that grants up to 139 of all attributes. Next we have the Taming Ring, that not only grants a great amount of damage but also a lot of elemental resistance. Finally, we also need a replica Soul Tether Belt. This one grants a huge survivability boost with Corrupted Soul. For clear speed, this build is a 10 out of 10. As mentioned before, you never need to stop. Just keep rolling with your Cyclone and killing everything. The boss damage deserves 9 out of 10. All those ice spears being casted grant a great shotgun effect on bosses. For the survivability, I would only give 8 out of 10. This build has a great amount of life, energy shield, regeneration, corrupted soul and instant leech. On the other hand, it needs to stay close to enemies and doesn't have high armor or spell suppression. And that's it guys! What do you think about the selection of code builds? Which one's your favorite? Don't forget to comment with your opinions and take a second to leave a thumbs up to support the channel. I wish you guys all the best and don't forget to keep building.